Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this AGU GeoHealth Early Career webinar. My name is Yiqun Ma. I'm a PhD student at the Yale School of Public Health and a member of the GeoHealth Early Career Committee. I will be moderating this webinar today. First of all, before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Olivia Ambrogio, let me briefly give some background information. The GeoHealth Early Career Committee is organizing an elevator pitch competition for early career researchers in the disciplinary field of GeoHealth. No matter whether you are an AGU member or not, you are invited to participate in this event. The winner of this competition will be recognized in the AGU Fall Meeting 2022. The AGU GeoHealth section will also cover winners' AGU annual membership dues for 2023. I will give more detailed information about this event at the end of this webinar, so please don't leave if you are interested. Independent of, but in support of this competition, fortunately, we invited Dr. Olivia Ambrogio, the Assistant Director of AGU Sharing Science Program, to share some tips and tricks for short presentations. Sharing Science is an AGU science communication and outreach program that offers resources, webinars, workshops, hands-on support, and opportunities to help scientists communicate more effectively with diverse audiences about Earth and space science and its importance and impact on society. Dr. Ambrogio is a biologist by training who helps other scientists connect with wider audiences through science communication. After Dr. Ambrogio's presentation, there will be a moderated Q&A session. Please ask questions in the chat to a participant named Ask Questions Here. Okay, without further ado, Dr. Ambrogio, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, and thank you to all of you for attending. I'm just going to share my slides. Go. Give me just a moment. There we go. So thank you again for the introduction. I can sort of skip quickly over these slides because you just learned what the Sharing Science program does. And again, it's to sort of provide skills, resources, and the confidence that scientists need to communicate effectively with really any audience that you desire to talk with. And we do this in a variety of different ways. So who am I? Well, my colleague Shane and I are sort of at the core of Sharing Science at AGU, but a number of our colleagues also support the program and do work that provides similar resources and training. Again, I'm a biologist. Primarily now I work as a SciComm facilitator like this, but I do occasionally do what I refer to as stealth educating, which is a bit of what I was doing in that picture there. Like, for example, if I'm on the beach, I'm happy to tell beachgoers everything they never knew they wanted to know about marine invertebrates. So with that, let's talk a little bit first about why it's so valuable to give presentations to a variety of audiences. And part of that is because why not, right? You do a lot of work to get the science that you're doing out there. You actually want it to get out there and for people to be aware of it. And presentations are a really great way both of adding to one's CV or resume, also sort of planting a flag and letting other researchers know that you're doing work in this area, and just letting people know about who you are and the work that you're engaged in so that you can kind of increase awareness both within scientific fields and outside of it. And of course, in giving presentations, you have the opportunity too to get input from those who are listening, which can sometimes be irritating, let's be honest, but often can be really valuable and help put a new perspective on what you're doing and give you new insights. It can let you meet people you might not otherwise meet, and through that, develop new collaborations that you might not have had otherwise. So something to remember when giving a presentation, and this is a really critical part of it, is that almost nobody knows what you're talking about. Let me use myself as an example. I am a scientist by training. I have a lot of experience working with other scientists, but often when somebody is telling me about their research, these are the expressions that I have. And I think it's just because we don't realize how quickly things become specialized. For example, when I was a graduate student, I was in a general biology department, and everybody had to give research presentations to the whole department at least once a year. And I'd listen to my colleagues who were ecologists studying plant life. And okay, I was an ecologist too, I could get most of it, but then they'd talk about Acer and Betula and Quercus, and I would have no idea what they were talking about. And if they had just said maple and birch and oak, or even trees in the area, suddenly I would have had some context for what they were doing. And I don't say this to mock, botanists in particular. It was sort of universal. I think we tend to forget when we're immersed in a field how much of what we are talking about is really specific and is not common knowledge to even other scientists outside of it. So a really great exercise that I recommend, well, first is to recognize that jargon creates this barrier, right? This unnecessary barrier between what we're trying to convey and our audience. And jargon includes the technical terminology, like the species names that I was mentioning, but also excessive or undefined acronyms, obscure or unnecessarily long words, or even words with multiple meanings. This is more true when your audience is folks outside the sciences. And by that, I mean words like this, where they might have a different sort of general public connotation than they do a scientific connotation. And I'm not saying you have to get rid of all of those words, but just to be very aware when you're speaking to people, what their first assumption might be, what they might originally be thinking about, and how you can sort of head that off early on by being more clear in what you're talking about. I just want to mention that at AGU and Sharing Science, we have a worksheet kind of helping recognize words with different meanings and also think about ways to help eliminate jargon. Also, incidentally, if you happen to think of some other words with multiple meanings that we don't have on this list, just let me know. We're always interested in adding to it. But that said, as I was saying earlier, sometimes it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to reduce my jargon so that it's more accessible. And then we don't even realize sometimes that there's still jargon. So an exercise that I highly recommend is called the Up Goer 5 Challenge. And some of you may have heard of this before or not. It was inspired by the comic XKCD, created by Randall Munroe, who used to be a physicist at NASA and now does comic making full time. And one of his better known comics is he made the Up Goer 5, which is a schematic of the Saturn V rocket, explained using only the 1,000 most common words in the English language. Only he said here 1,000 because 1,000 is not one of those common words. And it's kind of funny, things like people box, but it also, he really did describe the rocket. So this was both hilarious and inspiring to people. And folks like Theo Sanderson developed these Up Goer 5 text editors where you can type in what you're doing for your research or really anything, and it'll underline in red any of the words that you're not allowed to use. So this I really recommend as just a fun exercise because it forces you to break down what you're saying into very simple parts. Sometimes people have been able to be really eloquent about these. So for example, in this description of natural selection, evolution through natural selection, all the animals and green things we see in the world have been made by the same fixed, easy steps acting all around us. These steps taken in the largest sense are being, growing, and having babies, being like your parents, but not exactly like them, and being able to avoid dying for as long as possible. Now, I don't recommend typically, in spite of the eloquence of this one, using the Up Goer 5 as a method to get rid of jargon and then talking to people that way, because there are a lot of words that are not allowed amongst the 1,000 most common words, like ocean, for example. So you really don't want to try to give a presentation where you talk about the big water because people will think you're a jerk. But in doing this to begin with and taking this challenge, it can really help you because it forces you to say, okay, what is at the very base of my message. What is the real essence of what I'm trying to say? How can I say it in the simplest way possible? And then once you've done that, building that back up to a more conversational level is often a lot easier than trying to just, synonym your way out of your original abstract, if that makes sense. Another really important element of developing presentations that are going to be engaging is thinking about your audience. And there are so many kinds of audiences that you can have, right, for any number of presentations, from other scientists and folks in universities or other institutions, to those awarding grants, to potential collaborators in other sorts of fields, to any number of public groups, policy groups, and journalists. And in each circumstance, you're really going to want to think about what you know about this audience, and also why you're giving a presentation to begin with. So anytime you're giving a presentation, you want to think about your goals. What is your purpose in doing this? Are you trying to share new science with those who may be involved in working with it in the future? So you're trying to inform. Are you trying to entertain? Are you trying to educate? Are you trying to get people to do a certain thing? Do you have a call to action? What is your purpose in sharing this information to begin with? And then what are the goals of your audience? Why are they there listening to you? What are they hoping to get out of it? And then you want to think a little bit too about what you know about the audience, whether it's an individual or a group. What does this person or do these people care about? What are they interested in? What concerns? And how can you talk about your science in a way that's going to connect with that? Because you really do want to frame your message. And I drew this comic, this little cartoon, a while ago as a reflection of some of my own sad graduate school experiences, because I was so excited about my research that it didn't occur to me that not everybody else would be as excited, or that, let's put it differently, they might at least need a different kind of introduction to it to find it interesting, right? And that's what I mean by framing. It's not even about trying to persuade someone of something per se. It's about reshaping how you talk about what you're talking about in a way that echoes the interests of your audience, so that you're actually drawing them in instead of unintentionally chasing them away. And even when we're talking about other scientists, we too are people who have concerns beyond solely the field that we're in. We care about things like our quality of life, education, children's future, public health, economy, all kinds of different things. So again, depending on the audience and where you think their concerns are, you may want to think about how you can introduce your topic, or at least provide context for it. It's going to be the most compelling for whichever audience you're presenting to. And then, of course, you want to develop the messages that you actually want to present. So developing messages is important, rather than just saying, I'm going to just sort of share more or less what I know. Because again, you want to distill what you're talking about into what you want people to take away and remember. And there are just a few messaging tips that I have writ large. One is, again, thinking about audience, thinking about relevance. So you could say something like levels of soil moisture have decreased by whatever percentage. That's a message, that's true, and you've pulled information for it. But especially depending on what kind of background knowledge your audience has, changing that to say, decreases in soil moisture mean that drought has intensified, and that puts pressure on our water resources, and that increases the risk of dangerous wildfires. Now you're providing a relevance for that information that's going to matter more to everyone. Using metaphors can also really help people get a better sense of what's important and how it's important. So you could say removing or developing small patches of wilderness can be devastating for migrating birds. Okay, but imagine heading out on a cross-country trip and discovering there are no more rest stops until Montana. That's how birds feel when we get rid of their stopover points. This creates a more vivid picture of what it might be like of how it is affecting these bird populations. Using social math is also a really great way to help people better conceptualize what you're talking about. So with this volcano spurting jets of rock and gas, it is now oozing around 80,000 cubic meters of mud each day. Well, I know that that's large, right? But that's about as much as I've got. If you add even a little, like enough to fill 32 Olympic-sized swimming pools to that. Okay, admittedly, I have never seen 32 Olympic-sized swimming pools next to each other, but I've seen one. And so this gives me a better concept of just what an incredible volume of mud that is. And the nice thing about social math is that there are some existing resources for it. So you don't have to sort of come up with all of this by hand and calculate things yourself. The measure of things, especially that I've put on this slide, is a website where you can enter things like volumes or heights or some other measurements, and it will give you some equivalents. Like, oh, that's near the height of the Eiffel Tower, or that volume is similar to this, or it's as deep as the Grand Canyon, or what have you, so that you don't have to come up with everything from scratch in order to have some compelling examples to give people. And brevity is often important in presentations and in message development generally, but you don't want to be so brief that you lose any sort of meaning associated with what you're doing. So you could say, I study the Pine Island Glacier. Okay, now somebody knows you study glaciers. If you say, I study the Pine Island Glacier, the fastest melting glacier in Antarctica, responsible for about a quarter of Antarctica's ice loss thus far. Now, okay, they know where it is. They understand a little bit about why it might be interesting and important to study, and how it fits into this larger context of Antarctica and climate change and sea level rise altogether. And tied back to this issue of relevance is specificity. So you can say we're seeing an increase in the abundance of invasive species in the Chesapeake Bay. And again, that's a perfectly legitimate message, but it does not convey a lot of relevance because you haven't given any specifics that might resonate with your audience. If you say something like, when Chinese mitten crabs invade the bay, they push out blue crabs, which provide tens of millions of dollars for Maryland and Delaware's economy each year. Now, not only have you given examples of specific species, but you've given examples of specific impacts that they have on people, on society, that are going to matter. And this one, especially if you are talking about topics that can sometimes be a little depressing, and perhaps especially if you have some sort of call to action involved in what you're trying to convey through your presentation, if you want people to do something, you really want to try to end on a positive note. Because if you tell everyone the world is ending and then ask them to recycle, they are not going to be particularly motivated to do so. Whereas if you provide people with a sense of hope and agency, we have a great opportunity to safeguard our quality of life, make sure that all of these things are enjoyed by generations to come. Now you are helping people see why they should take some initiative, because they can make a positive difference. It's okay to have messages about things that are depressing, because let's face it, a lot of things are. But you want to try not to end that way, because a lot of research has shown, psychological research, that when people hear only negative messages, they tend to either fall into despair, which makes them not want to do anything, or they go into denial because it's just too upsetting to contemplate. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about making short messages. And by that in particular, I want to talk about developing elevator pitches, just for a moment. And the whole concept of an elevator pitch relates to how short it is, right? The idea that It's the amount that you could tell someone in the time that it takes you both to travel on an elevator to your floor. But really, I think for having effective elevator pitches, you want to develop 3 different levels of them. Let's put it that way. You want to have your absolute basic pitch, right? The 1 to 2 sentences that you can have sort of on hand when somebody asks you, oh, what do you do? Then you want to have a sort of medium length pitch, something that's between 30 seconds and a minute to kind of expand upon that a little bit or explain a little bit more about what you're doing and why it matters. And finally, you want what I call the long pitch, about 2 to 3 minutes on your work. If someone says, oh, tell me more, or you have a few more minutes to talk with someone. So you can speak a little bit more about your work in a wider context, maybe with a couple of really important elements or an interesting anecdote or recent something recent that you've learned. Another really important part of an elevator pitch, though, in addition to its brevity, is providing context and significance for what you're talking about. You have to remember, again, as you're thinking about audience, you need to be able to share why what you're doing is important and to whom. So for example, how does it affect people or society? And I don't necessarily mean the particular study that you're doing in this moment, because it may be an incremental advance that fits into something larger. But how does that area of science help? How does it have an impact on people, on the world, on the economy, on the landscape, on habitat degradation, on climate change, whatever it might be? Or if what you're doing is much more sort of in the spirit of discovery or looking at the stars or something like that, how does what you're looking at give us a better understanding of our place in the universe or push boundaries of what we know and what we think about the world? I had a former colleague who would sometimes ask scientists when she was interviewing them, she was a science writer, so why should we care? And not in an aggressive or mean way. She was genuinely asking them to kind of pull a little more, to push a little more, to be able to explain why a readership should care about the science, because she knew there was a reason. Sometimes it's just hard for us to bring that to the surface, but that's really important to do. And then also, again, in what larger context does this fit? For people who are not working in this area day to day, what is the background that they might not have to know what we already know or what we don't yet know that is leading to the kinds of questions that you're asking now? And then finally, you want to add a little pizzazz, right? Because if you've managed to make something short, but no one remembers it, then you still haven't really achieved your goal. So how can you make it a little bit snappy, a little bit memorable, what you're talking about? Can you add some sort of hook or personal details? And I'll come back to this hook idea in a minute. But, you know, for example, sometimes if I was talking about my science, I would mention that I got my equipment at Home Depot and Target, and the staff there would get really confused when I explained that I needed an O-ring small enough to cut in half and tether to the back of a snail that I was then going to put on a patio tile in the field. Or can you mention something that's especially perhaps surprising or exciting about either your work in particular or that field of study? Again, something to go back to my own time in science that I would mention is that the snails I studied change sex. Now, this is not novel from a scientific perspective. It's been known for at least 100 years, but it's cool and it's something that people would get excited about. Or do you have a moment within what you're talking about to explain what drew you to this work? Did you always have a passion for gems and minerals and a huge rock collection when you were a kid? Were you actually planning to be a doctor like your parents wanted, but then you took this one astronomy course for credit and looked through the telescope and you were hooked? You know, or is it not even something so passionate about a specific subject area? Is it more like you are from an agricultural community and you really want to do work that's going to help inform the decisions that communities like that make in the future? And then sort of tying into this idea of pizzazz and the hooks that I mentioned, can you add elements of story to your presentation. And I really recommend this because there's a lot of research out there that shows how we respond to stories in a different way than we respond to almost any other presentation of information. If I'm telling you a story about how, I was running because I was running late for a plane and I knew I should have gone earlier, but then the taxi driver was talking to me the whole time, which was not helping at all. And so I was rushing through the airport, but trying not to actually run because I didn't want security to come and find me suspicious, but going fast, and I tripped on the floor and slammed my chin down and blood was spurting. And now, of course, security was interested in me anyway, and I wasn't going to get to my plane. When I'm telling you all of this, certain parts of my brain are lighting up. And the same parts of your brain are. We're kind of mirroring each other. We're experiencing this moment simultaneously. Also, when we use a lot of the vivid language of storytelling, say words related to texture like slick, wrinkly, velvety, the sensory cortex in our brain lights up. Or the motor cortex when we describe slammed, leapt, through, jammed, just as if we were actually experiencing these actions or these moments. So it creates a much more interactive way to connect with people than just giving a presentation that doesn't involve any aspect of story. When I talk about stories, though, one way that I'm talking about them is the structure of a story. And you can one way to look at that, and it's not the only way, but a way to look at it is through this sort of Freytag's triangle, this narrative arc. And you can basically see this drawing here as a change in narrative suspense over time. So what this looks like basically in a lot of stories is you start with some sort of exposition. Once upon a time, there was a poor fisherman, or when I was little, I loved to look at the stars, right? Then you have an inciting incident. Something happens, something comes up, and now the protagonist of whatever story you're in, or protagonists, want to do something in response to that change, to achieve some goal in response to that change. Then you have what's called the rising action. Your protagonist or protagonists are overcoming obstacles on their way to try to achieve this. Then you have the climax, right? The aha moment. A cure is found. You have a contest. You fight the dragon, whatever it is. Then you have the falling action. Other things that happen after that moment that sort of resolve other elements of what characters have been going through. And finally, you have what's called the resolution. Where are the characters? What is the situation now? And the really important thing that makes something a story is that the characters, the situation, the condition is not the same at the end as it was at the beginning. Knowing what the change is often a really great way to figure out what the story is that you're telling. And I want to emphasize that even with short presentations, you can still tell stories. Stories can be short, partly because, as with these two cartoons I drew, because we all have sort of an internal sense of general narrative structure and story arcs, we can fill in the pieces for ourselves, even if there's only part of the story shown. So like, so what if we're predator and prey? I love him. We can imagine a whole kind of thwarted love story a la Romeo and Juliet within this one panel, or he said it was over, so I ate him. We have this whole like mystery or film noir, or whatever else we could create for ourselves from that, because we are good at filling in other parts of stories. You can see this too as examples if you look at one sentence stories. I realized last night the feeling I was chasing during my pot smoking years was the feeling I now get holding my newborn son. So within that small space, we get a whole sense of where someone was, what they were looking for and didn't find, and how they finally achieved that, right? Commercials are also really great examples of how people tell stories in a very short period of time. Also being able to manipulate our emotions very effectively. But these are all non-scientific examples. So let me also give you an example of a science story that can be told in a short period of time. Now I can't read all of my screens, so forgive me, but I'll have to see. In the crowded cities of 19th century Europe, these diseases were a regular and terrifying scourge. The French scientist Louis Pasteur, whose previous work advanced germ theory, felt he could apply his principles to finding cures. He was studying cholera in chickens, but nothing seemed to be working, all of these obstacles, right? Until one day, an assistant forgot to inject chickens with fresh bacteria and used old bacteria. These chickens didn't die. Even when Pasteur injected them with fresh bacteria, they survived. And he realized that exposing patients to weakened bacteria allows them to develop an immunity to full-strength disease. This realization and the vaccines it led to have changed the world and saved millions of lives. So again, within this small space, you have a lot of that story structure so that we can kind of get into it. It doesn't have as many vivid details as one would like, right? But it is pretty condensed, but you can kind of see how a story can come out of science, even in a small time period. That said, maybe you don't feel comfortable creating a whole story, or you don't think they're time. It's okay to have just a hook, which is, say, part of a story, something exciting, part of setting the scene that's going to draw people in, even if you're not including all of the elements of a narrative arc. And part of what you can do with that to help people feel that this is a more compelling narrative is think about how you can include things like how you were feeling during the process of research. What was frustrating? What was confusing? What was exhilarating? Also, what were you experiencing as you were engaging in whatever you were doing? What were you feeling, hearing, seeing, smelling? Being able to bring in at least elements of this so that people can feel as if they are in the moment with you can be a really effective part of giving presentations, even if you're not telling a full story. Okay, I spent a lot of time talking about the content of presentations. Let me talk for just a couple of minutes about some other presentation tips, whether you're giving these in person or virtually. Again, you don't want to have a situation where you are presenting something so dense or so impenetrable that either no one is paying attention or they're paying attention to the wrong things. One way to avoid this is to pay attention to how much text you have on slides if you're using slides. So this example here is terrible, right? This is terrible. It doesn't matter if the text is important. Anybody who sees this slide is going to immediately sort of fall into a fugue state because they are so horrified. This version is a little bit better. I would still actually use just one of these points at a time on a single slide rather than both, because it still feels a little bit heavy, but at least it's not quite as overwhelming and we have a pretty picture to look at. And then you want to avoid doing a lot of reading straight from slides. Again, if you have less text on them, you're solving that already. But that is something to keep in mind. And honestly, really reading from anywhere, whether it's slides, whether it's notes, whatever it might be. Now, it was hard to find a picture of this because we don't really take pictures of people reading from slides or reading from notes. But I just have these images up more as a reminder for me of the fact that if you are reading, typically your eyes are going to be on something else. If you're virtual, it might be on another screen like this, or you might be looking down like this. If you're in person, the same thing. It is less engaging for an audience if you don't seem to be looking at them or facing towards them or kind of being in the moment. And then especially with short presentations, or especially with presentations to audiences outside of your field of expertise, don't get bogged down in details, right? You don't need to go into every element of the methods. You don't need to talk about every element of results. You just need to talk in broad terms about your findings. And remember that, especially if it is a more professional audience, scientifically professional audience, they can always ask you more questions afterwards if they want to learn more. And try to practice rather than memorize what you're going to say. Again, better not to read, but even better, rather than writing out a script and memorizing it, try to write down sort of notes to yourself of, okay, I want to hit on this point, I want to hit on this point, I want to talk about this thing. Because sometimes if we memorize a particular script, even if we're not reading it, it can still sound a little bit more stilted, a little bit more formal. Whereas if you just know more or less what you want to say, you might be saying it in slightly different words every single time you say it, as for me with this presentation, but you're still getting your point across. And it doesn't feel quite so strict. And then related to that, try to be dynamic, or as dynamic as you can. Smile if you can, express emotions. If you're like me and you gesticulate a lot as you talk, go ahead and do that. That's part of your process. Try to make sure that you are expressing some of the excitement that you feel about your work so that you can also instill that excitement in your audience. And another thing that you can do that's really valuable if you're using visuals is to try to enhance the presentation with them. Visuals are a really great way to explain things when it's simpler for people to see it than to hear it being described. It's a really great way, again, of adding something memorable. It's a really great way of better illustrating literally your point. Infographics are one really excellent way of trying to explain something complex, whether it's something like what are the size of different ocean giants based on the scale of a diver, it continues from the bottom to the top, or as a means of using social math, like this AGU infographic about raindrops. You can see, they're saying compared to a penny, compared to an Advil. Admittedly, these are very sort of US-centric social math elements, but something like that can, again, allow people to have a better conception of what you're talking about. Flowcharts are also a nice way if you know you do have a lot of text, but you want to make it a little bit more visually appealing, and you want to emphasize that element of flow, of movement, of connection between one part of it and another. Flowcharts are a really nice way to go with that. Illustrations are a great way to explain things. Like here's me explaining using a Y maze to figure out how snails basically smell their way to what they're looking for and how we find out whether or not they're using smell to navigate the world around them. And you can also use illustrations to add humor. So this is a personal ad I drew about anglerfish to illustrate how very weird their love lives are. Or this is an XKCD comic about what it means if you see an aurora by latitude. Again, mostly writing, but pretty hilarious. And I want to emphasize too that if there's something you really want to illustrate, but you think, well, I can't really draw, you don't necessarily have to. This little cartoon that I drew, I've had more people ask if they can use it with attribution than any of the fancier stuff that I've drawn, because it really struck a chord with people, not because it is, technically well done. Or similarly, there's an artist who decided to just draw basically a palette of what her area looked like in April. If you have a way that is relevant for what you're talking about to sort of show a spectrum of colors around what you're doing, that can also be visually appealing without requiring you to do any kind of drawing that you feel uncomfortable with. And then, of course, too, using photography or short videos is another really great way of kind of telling a story around your science, showing images of you doing your work to give people a better sense of what's involved. Again, photography can serve the same purpose as illustration in explaining something like methods that might otherwise be complex, or just helping people get a sense of where you are and what you're doing. And in addition to video and photography, audio can also be an element that you can add if you have some that can enhance a presentation. Maybe there is some kind of characteristic sound that is related to the work you do, the studies you do, what you've encountered, that either proves a point that you're trying to make through the presentation, or is just kind of a cool addition that will help people remember what you're up to. That can also be really valuable. And I also want to emphasize that you do not have to make any of these yourself if you feel that you don't have them or that you're daunted by the task. There are a lot of options for finding things in the public domain that will allow you with attribution to share them in presentations, so long as you're not charging money for them. Or if you happen to know someone, a colleague or a friend or someone else who may have a video or image, you can ask them if you can use theirs as well. So don't let what you have yourself in your library stop you from sharing some multimedia if you know of some other way you can get it. And with that, I just want to mention again that Sharing Science offers a lot of resources on helping to develop messages and hone those for different audiences. I'll share a link in a minute. If you have not yet joined AG's Sharing Science community, you don't have to be a member to join. It allows for a discussion section where people can talk with each other about SciComm. There's also a big resource section on the social science around science communication. So do consider that. If you like the idea of stories around science, do check out our podcast, because a lot of that is related to science storytelling and has scientists telling their stories. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ambrogio, for your fantastic talk. It's really informative. We got a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is how to avoid cramming too much information by talking quickly, yet still give the audience substance.
That's a great question, and one that perhaps I have not always figured out myself. I think part of that relates to practice, right? So you want to first think about, how can I narrow down what I'm talking about into just a few main messages, especially if you have a very short presentation that you're planning. And then I would recommend practicing with an audience of people who don't already know a lot about that scientific area. So you can see if the pace at which you're talking and the information that you're giving is enough, or if they say, wow, that was too much, I just couldn't understand it. So I think, first of all, being able to kind of have a test, and then from there, if they say it's too much, figuring out what you can maybe drop. This is a really great thing generally to practice with people who don't necessarily have experience with the field, not just to get feedback on whether or not you're talking too fast or putting too much in, but also just to see whether the messages you think you're conveying are the ones that are being taken away. So if you practice with people and then ask them afterwards, so what would you say was my main point? If they tell you something that you really didn't want to be your main point, that's really helpful and gives you a sense of what you need to emphasize.
Thank you. They are really good suggestions. The second question is about how to overcome audience preconceived biases in a presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it depends on the circumstances. If we're thinking about it, so often where this comes up in the work that I do is people who are in fields like climate science, having to deal with audiences that may be skeptical about the whole idea of global warming or climate change. And in situations like that, you really want to start by, even more so than with regular audience interactions, you really want to start by making connections rather than starting with the facts or the information you have. So if you are a member of the community that you're talking to, that's a good place to start, sort of building some connection there. Or you can even appeal to people around elements of climate change, for example, without using that term, that they themselves may have observed. So maybe you want to ask people what their experience has been, say with extreme weather events, or if you're in a coastal area with sea level rise or flooding or something like that, so that you're getting people to share with you and build a relationship before you bring in a topic that they might otherwise be more skeptical about.
Thank you for your wonderful advice. It's really helpful. And the next question is, if I have different audiences at the same time, for example, both expert and non-expert, what can I do to ensure my presentation satisfies the needs of both of them?
It's a great question, and it is challenging to figure that out. I recommend trying to aim to be accessible to the non-expert audience first and foremost, because otherwise you lose them entirely. You can do a few things to make sure that you're still demonstrating your own expertise to the expert audience. One is to offer to go into more detail about things in a question period if you have the time for that. Another is to, again, depending on the time of your presentation, do two versions of, say, a results slide, where one is the kind of broader picture, where you're saying, this is what we found, here are the main points, here are the highlights, so that hopefully everyone is understanding what you're saying. And then for a brief period of time, you can show a second slide, or if you're not showing slides, touch upon in more detail the methods or the results that would be most interesting to an expert audience. So those are a couple of ways to address that.
Thank you for sharing these useful tips. And the next question is about jargons. The audience said, I have a lot of jargons in my presentation. How do I choose which ones to explain and which not to explain, as the time is limited?
That's a really good question too. I would say try to get rid of or rephrase as many as possible. The ones where you want to end up keeping them are if they are terms that are really central to whatever you're studying. If the name of the process that you use or the technique that you're studying or the specific question that you have has some jargon within it, that would be the point at which you say, okay, I need to explain this phrase, or maybe these two phrases. But beyond that, as much as possible, trying to rephrase to get rid of jargon is really the best way to approach it.
Yeah, thank you for your great answer. And the next one is related to your presentation. The question is, can you share some strategies to quickly catch audience attention at the beginning of a presentation? A joke may work, but is there any more professional ways?
Yes, so there are a few things. You can ask a question of the audience, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one that they have to answer necessarily. It can be more rhetorical, it can be more just sort of asking them to think about their own experience. That's one way to kind of draw people in and give them a sense that, oh, this is related to something that I may have knowledge of or may have experience with, or that may be interesting to me. You can try to give an example from your own work of something that was dramatic or challenging, or that made you ask a new question. You can try to provide an interesting story in a wider context about how this research came about. So for example, maybe you want to bring up something like when this researcher in 1920 was doing this, they wondered why this was happening. Now we know so much more about this part, but we're still sort of looking off into this vast space, and that's why I'm asking this question, something like that.
Thank you so much. And next question is not related to the presentation itself, but about the Q&A session. Can you provide any tips on how to answer questions?
Let's see. I think there again, having the opportunity to practice in advance is really useful with people who may be similar to the kind of audience you're going to actually work with. And if you get them to ask you some questions afterwards, it helps to prepare you for the kinds of questions you may receive, because the more you yourself think about those questions and try to anticipate them, and the more that others help you get an idea, the less you'll be sort of taken by surprise. That said, there are always going to be questions that are less expected, let's say. And what I would encourage there is to be willing to take a moment. It's okay to say, oh, that's really interesting. let me think for a minute about this, and then do, rather than feeling that you have to know everything in the moment. It's also okay to say something like, you know what, this is very interesting. I want to think a little bit more about how it would work. And here's what I know right now, but if we could talk more about this later, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you for your wonderful advice. And our final question is about career planning. Do you have any suggestions or guidance for people looking to go into a science communication related career?
Yeah, I would say there are a few things. One is practice science communication as much as you can so that you have that experience to refer to when you're looking into that field. The other is to see what sorts of institutions or organizations are doing science communication in the realm that you are interested in. See what those positions look like. See who's out there that you could look for jobs, with. And also, don't be afraid to do a lot of what are called informational interviews while you're still in your current position, which is to say, reach out to people, even people you don't know, who are working in fields that you find interesting, to ask them if they'd be willing to talk to you about their own career path or any advice they might have, because most people are really eager to help if they can.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Ambrogio, for coming today. And in the last 5 minutes, let me share more information about our AGU GeoHealth early career research elevator pitch. Let me share my screen. Okay, first, this event is open to all early career researchers, no matter whether you are an AGU member or not. And the goal of this event is to provide a platform for early researchers in GeoHealth around the world to showcase their research, expand their network by connecting with their peers, connect to potential mid-career and senior mentors, and receive valuable recommendations from a panel of reviewers and their peers on how to improve the presentation skills. The competition will be held virtually in 3 phases. The first phase is to fill out the pre-registration form. All the interested participants should fill this pre-registration form before August 5. You only need to provide the title of your talk, the general topic of your research, and contact information. It's quite simple. The second phase is to upload a 3-minute recording. All the participants who have already filled the pre-registration form will upload a 3-minute recording before September 2. Additional information about the recordings and the uploading webpage will be provided later. The recordings of all the participants after screening will become available through AGU GeoHealth website and AGU YouTube channel, but you all can opt out for posting your video on public platforms. The third phase is peer review and feedback. While a panel of mid-career and senior reviewers will evaluate your recordings and provide anonymous feedback, you also have the chance to assess the presentation of your peers. The details of this phase will also be announced later. And finally, winners will be invited to present their research in AGU GeoHealth early career webinar in November. They will be also recognized in AGU Fall Meeting 2022. The AGU GeoHealth section will also cover the winners' AGU annual membership dues for 2023. If you have any further questions, please contact us via this email address. And also, our committee will send out emails and post advertisements on Twitter soon after this webinar. So please stay tuned. So please, if you are interested in this event, please fill out the registration form. Let me send the link to the chat. At the end, if you are interested in this webinar series, please sign up for the GeoHealth Early Career webinars so that you can get notification about our future webinars. Thank you again for joining us today and have a good day.